Hello friends, welcome back. I just wanted to put together a really quick video in case some of you still weren't quite sure what our last theory, deconstruction, was all about. Hopefully the article was easy enough to kind of give you the main idea, but just in case I thought I would touch on some of its main ideas. And deconstruction really is nothing more than asking questions of a text, trying to make sense of something that on its surface looks very solid and unquestionable. So if something doesn't make sense to you and you start to ask questions and probe a little bit deeper, then hopefully you come up with the right answer, or at least an answer that satisfies you as a reader and as a writer. For example, you might be questioning what's what's going on with Trevor's hair. This is what happens when you're I'm looking at myself in the camera. This is what happens when you're on quarantine. I need my hair cut. God. So you might remember back on day one, I told you that I love the 1950s. And when I think of the 50s, I think of things like cars with tail fins. I think of guys in leather jackets, you know, those greasers with their hair piled up on top of their head. I think of girls in poodle skirts. I think, of course, of Elvis Presley. I think of Saturday night sock hops, where teenagers went to dances and did things like dances called the twist and the mashed potatoes. I think of jukeboxes with the rainbow lights and little bubbles that go up on either side. I love that stuff. Now, obviously, I was not alive in the 1950s. I didn't live that decade, and if you think that I'm that old, shut up. Stop it. Obviously, I was not there in the 1950s, but I have an appreciation for it. And so all those ideas that I mentioned create this structure. This is what I think of the 1950s, all those things I just listed there for you. However, deconstruction comes along, and although it sounds violent, like it's just this wholesale destruction of ideas, that's not what deconstruction is. Deconstruction is a slow and careful sort of dismantling of a structure that on its surface looks safe and secure and trustworthy and complete. And basically deconstruction says it's not as solid as you think, and there are some problems with your structure. For example, everything I just mentioned about the 1950s, for a long time I used to think, oh, I was born in the wrong time, I would love to live back in the 50s. But a deconstructivist would say, well, hold on, because back in the 1950s, life wasn't so great for women. They didn't have much choice available to them as far as career. They were supposed to just be a wife and mother. If they wanted a job, they were a secretary, or maybe a school teacher, or a nurse. But that was pretty much it as far as what they were allowed to do and allowed to be. Of course, African Americans still in the 1950s were being abused and assaulted and lynched and murdered, and were sprayed down busy city streets with fire hoses whenever they got together to protest for equal rights. And of course, the LGBT community was absolutely invisible in the 1950s. It's not that they weren't there, but there was no representation, there were no allies, there was no one looking out for them. And so if you dig a little bit deeper beneath the kind of colorful party and confetti sort of ideas that I have of the 1950s, it really wasn't such a great time after all. And deconstruction asks us to look through that filter and find some of the issues and poke holes with an idea that seems pretty solid and complete at first glance. Right. The first sort of rule of this theory is that language is not stable. That's kind of the whole main idea of this theory. In general, we don't like chaos. We actually thrive on order. As human beings and as a culture, we like structure, right? When you were kids, you may not have realized this, but you really craved discipline. You wanted it. Because discipline meant there was order. And order gives kids security. Children like the idea of routine. They can't articulate it, they can't really tell you that, but that's part of creating sort of a safe environment for kids, is this idea of order and routine. In other words, there's a center holding everything together. Growing up, that center in your life may have been your parents or guardians, whoever the most trusted adult was in your life. That would have been your center. So another example would be our classroom. You know, you walk into the room, if we were there, and you would take your seat probably in your usual spot. There's no assigned seating, but we like to sort of claim territory here. So you would be in your spot, and that would be your position from which you would sort of observe the rest of the class around you. And I would go up to the front of the classroom and take my position there. When I speak, you're listening. When I'm doing my presentation and my lecture, you're sitting there, you know, taking notes, or you're listening, allegedly. Those are the things you're doing. Maybe playing with your phone when you're not supposed to. But while I stand there and do my job, you sit there and do whatever it is you're doing. You do your job as student. And you generally don't leave. You know, you're there listening. If you do leave to go to the restroom, you generally will come back. And so that's sort of the business of the classroom. That's how it works. So I am at the center of that structure, right? I stand there and I make the rules of the room, and I decide what it is you need to do to pass my class. I create the assignments, but I don't necessarily have to do them. I create the rules of the room, but I don't necessarily have to follow them myself. And even if you went into the classroom next door, even though the rules might be a little different and the requirements to pass that course are a little bit different, the structure is still the same, right? There are assignments, there are rules. It's the same structure pretty much any room you go into. Structuralism says all these things are essentially the same. Now, a deconstructivist would say that the center cannot hold, that there are problems with structure if you look close enough at it. For example, if you're waiting outside in the morning and I don't come to class, and it's been 20 minutes, 25, 30 minutes, and I have not shown up, I have not sent you a text message to say, hey, I'm stuck in traffic, or one of my kids got sick, I'm so sorry. If you hear nothing from me in 30 minutes, what are you going to do? Well, you're probably going to go back home or sit and wait for your next class after hours. That means that all the players are in play. So the structure has essentially fallen apart. If I'm not there to kind of keep us together and rope us all in together into the room, then you guys kind of scatter, right? The rules have been thrown out the window. If we go back to my Tinker Toy structure here, if I were to start stacking books on top of this, I would get a nice tall pile of books here. In fact, it's so sturdy, I think I could probably get from the floor to the ceiling, and nothing would really happen to this because it's a nice solid compact cube. It's a nice little structure. But a deconstructivist says, well, let's look a little bit closer. If we take out one of the strongest features of this structure, well, look what happened. It's suddenly very, very flimsy. And if I start stacking books on top of this now, I'm not going to get very far before this part sort of buckles and everything falls over. So a deconstructivist says this isn't as strong as you thought, because if you remove just one part of it, it all just kind of blows apart. All right, I have another example here I want to show you of a structure that on its surface looks pretty sturdy until we apply some good old-fashioned deconstruction to it and pick it apart and show it for what it really is. This is a definition of what it is to be a family, and this is from 1970. So according to 1970 standards, a family is this. A family is a social group defined by a common residence, economic cooperation, and reproduction. It includes marriage of both sexes with one or more biological children. Okay, it looks like a pretty standard definition of what a family is, but if we take a closer look at it, we can start crossing off some things that may not apply to us personally. For example, all families don't live in a common residence. If your parents divorced, maybe some of you lived at one parent's house and would visit the other parent a few times a week, so you were sort of being transported between two different houses. I did that briefly when I was a little boy. I went between two houses. So we can definitely cross that off. According to this definition, there's economic cooperation, meaning both parents have jobs. We know that's not true. Maybe one parent works and the other stays home to help out with the house and, tend to the kids a little bit more. Or in this time of coronavirus, maybe both parents are out of a job at the moment, and families are spending a lot more time together. So we can get rid of this idea that doesn't define a family. And reproduction. You don't have to have children in order to be a family. I know plenty of couples who don't have kids, but that doesn't make that couple any less loving or less of a family unit just by themselves. You don't need kids to be a family. I really wish someone had told me that. A family includes marriage of both sexes. We know that's not true anymore. We've become a much more inclusive society, and so we kind of have adopted that phrase, love is love. So we can get rid of this sort of archaic, old-fashioned idea. And finally, with one or more biological children. If you have kids, they don't have to be biological. Maybe some of you were adopted. Of course, my 4 kids, we adopted ours, so there's a very big place in my heart for adoptees. So no, children, if they are in the present or in the family, they do not need to be biological. So all we're left with here is a family is a social group. And, here in the 21st century, that kind of short, brief definition of family really kind of makes the most sense. A family is what you bring into it, not by these sort of old-fashioned definitions. So we can see that much better thanks to deconstruction. So basically, when we think about our language and how it works, we tend to believe in it. We tend to believe that it is fixed, stable, definite, and reliable. But deconstruction says, no, not quite. It's never as clear as you think. And you need to ask questions to get closer to the truth. Another quick example of this is with our president, Donald Trump. Back in 2016, when he launched his campaign, or a little bit even sooner than that, his campaign slogan was, "Let's make America great again." Now, the tricky word here is again. And right away, the deconstruction part of my mind jumped right on that slogan and thought, well, if you're trying to make America great again, that means there's a time period you want to go back to. There's some time period that he believes was better than the one that we were currently in. And so the question becomes, according to deconstructive thinking, when was that? When was America great that he wants to try and go back to again? I hope not the 50s. We just talked about why that wouldn't work. The 60s were some of the hardest, actually that was probably one of the most difficult decades in all of American history, between the rioting, the fight for equal rights, the escalation of the Vietnam War. The 60s were a rough time to be alive. In the 70s, we had the Great Recession, which is just a fancier word for another Great Depression. The 70s were very difficult. We saw a jump in homelessness. We saw the greatest divide between social classes happen in the 1970s. Does he want to go back to the 1800s in the time of slavery and civil war? Does he want to go back to our nation's founding? Was he proud of that when we were slaughtering entire tribes of Native Americans or burning women at the stake for being witches? Now the thing is, we try to pick up that thread and follow it along, right? That's the idea of trace that is talked about in the article. We're trying to trace what Donald Trump meant. And it's sort of hard to do because neither the president nor anyone in his administration has ever defined when America was great. When is that time he wants to go back to? And the article that you read has this really great example of reading a book, except the last chapter gets taken out. Now, you've been led to the end of the book and you can probably guess at what the ending was, but you could be totally wrong and you would never know. And it's the same with Make America Great Again. We kind of get the idea of what he's trying to convey, but we're getting to the end of the thread. We're getting to the end of that trace. We don't know what he meant, and we may never know. All right, the next major idea in deconstruction is that a text has multiple meanings. And of course you know that's true, and that's sort of what makes English so fun to do. And you did this with your first essay where you put a character on trial. Some of you who were talking about the same story felt very strongly about sending your character to prison, while others would look at the same character and see them as sort of a sympathetic person, someone they were trying to help, based on the clues that they decided to use to support their argument. So this is a pretty obvious one, that we look for multiple meanings. I wrote on the board behind me a word, Kika, K-I-K-A, Kika. I don't know if you know what that word is or what language in the world it comes from. You shouldn't. It's not a real word. If you did recognize it, if you did know what it means, then you need help. Stop this video and go find help immediately. When we adopted our kids, our son Jonathan was the youngest at only 2 years old. He actually wasn't quite 2 yet. And Kika was the only word that he knew. And he would use it in different ways in order to communicate to us what he was trying to say or what he was trying to ask for. For example, if we handed him a toy, he'd say, "Oh, Kika." So that was his word for thank you. If any of us sneezed, he'd say, "Oh, Kika." So he was saying bless you in his own little Jonathan way. If we said, "Hey, we're going to go bye-bye, let's go for a ride," he'd say, "Kika?" He was asking a question. He wanted to know where. And you knew that, and we knew that because of his inflection, the way he raised his voice at the end of the phrase. Whenever we ask questions, we tend to do that with our speech. We kind of bend it up at the end. And he had absorbed enough human language to understand that if he has a question, he has to make that sound, and that's how he did it. All right, here's another example with a real word, an actual English word, the word minute. What is a minute? Obviously, it's a measurement of time, right? How many minutes in an hour. However, even our language can be confusing. If I put the emphasis on the second half of the word here and say minute, the chances of you passing my class are minute. Completely different word. Now it means small. So minute went from a measurement of time to minute, which is a measurement of size. And finally, the last main idea of deconstruction is this idea that readers argue with authors. And that's not disrespectful or anything like that. In fact, this theory encourages you to do so. For example, this old phrase, love is like a rose. Well, the writer probably meant that love is beautiful, right? But those of us who are a little more cynical and a little more realistic, we might see this phrase and argue with the author and say, you're right, love is like a rose. Its beauty fades, it doesn't last forever, it can be thorny, it dies. So there are ways that we can take something that looks pretty sturdy and basically fight back with the author on that one. Alright guys, that was it for this video. I just wanted to kind of quickly show you the highlights of this theory that was dreamed up by a man named Jacques Derrida. Remember, Derrida is the name of the philosopher who created the theory. The theory itself is called deconstruction. At this point in the semester, if we were still together, I would have shown you a movie already. And it was this movie, see it there, The Exorcism of Emily Rose. And the reason I had picked this movie to show you is because it's about a trial. A priest is on trial for the murder of Emily Rose, who dies during the course of his exorcism. And this is a great example of a story arguing with itself. And you see one side of the court case present the priest as a murderer, while the other side of the case presents him as a holy man who was actually in a real fight against supernatural demons and spirits and all kinds of things. So this is by no means, this is not required. You don't have to watch it. You know, you're on your own time. But if you're bored and you want something to do and you want a scary movie that maybe you haven't seen before, I would recommend Exorcism of Emily Rose because it shows deconstruction at work. You see a story arguing with itself. Another example is an older movie, I think it's from the 90s, called The Truman Show, starring Jim Carrey. And it's about a guy who doesn't realize his entire life has been a reality show. And the world around him is fake. Everyone in his life are actors. The whole neighborhood, every place he lives is just a set that's been designed for him. Now he doesn't know that. And so in that story you have this clash of realities. You have the reality he knows versus the one that is actually working against him. And so he has to take that, oh, I lost my toy. So he has to take that structure of his life and start poking holes in it to figure out what's really going on. And one last example is this movie here called Stranger Than Fiction, starring Will Ferrell. And in this movie, he's a guy in his 40s who wakes up one day to discover that he is actually a character in someone's book. and he has no idea how he got there or where he's going, but he needs to figure out who is writing him and what is going to happen to him, because his life seems to be very quickly moving into tragedy. So again, you have this idea of his reality that he has grown up with and is very comfortable and safe with, that he now has to try and deconstruct to figure out what's really going on and what's going to happen. All right, friends, that was it. Stay safe, stay healthy. I wish I could see you in person just so we could do more stuff together, but we're almost done. Hang in there. We've got a couple more stories to get through, and we are done with the semester. So again, if you have questions, email me anytime. Other than that, have a wonderful, wonderful week. Bye. Bye, 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 bye.